November 14th, 1967, 11:32 p.m., Small's Paradise. Frank Lucas walked into that jazz club wearing a $3,000 suit and a smile that said he owned the world. And why wouldn't he? At 36 years old, he was moving more heroin through Harlem than the Italian mob ever dreamed of. Blue Magic was his brand, pure, deadly, and stamped with his reputation. Every hustler, every player, every person who mattered knew Frank Lucas was untouchable. Except one man never got the memo. Bumpy Johnson sat alone at a corner booth, nursing cognac, like he had all the time in the world. 62 years old, sick, dying, actually, but still the most dangerous man in Harlem, because Bumpy didn't need muscle anymore. He just needed to know things. Frank walked over, confident. "Mr. Johnson, didn't expect to see you out tonight." Bumpy didn't smile, didn't stand. Just slid a manila envelope across the table. "Open it," Bumpy said quietly. Frank's hands were steady as he lifted the flap. Then he saw the photos, his heroin packages, his dealers, his corners, his empire, all documented, all dated, all damning. What nobody tells you about that moment, the bartender later said, is that Frank Lucas went pale. Not scared, not angry, just empty, like he'd been caught doing something he knew was unforgivable. Bumpy took a slow sip of his drink. You broke the only rule that mattered. What happened next changed everything, because those photos didn't just expose a heroin operation. They exposed the one betrayal Bumpy Johnson could never forgive: poisoning your own people. This is the story of how Frank Lucas won everything and lost the only thing that mattered, and how 15 years in a prison cell taught him that Bumpy Johnson had been right all along. To understand why that envelope felt like a death sentence, you need to understand who these men were. Frank Lucas arrived in Harlem in 1946 from North Carolina, poor, angry, and hungry. He'd watched his cousin get murdered by the Klan. He'd seen what powerlessness looked like, and he swore he'd never be powerless again. The legend says they met at a pool hall on 118th Street. A hustler was running a 1,000 per game con. Frank, with $3 in his pocket, accepted the bet anyway. That's when Bumpy Johnson walked in. Everyone stopped talking. Not because Bumpy was big, he was 5'9", maybe 160 pounds. But because Bumpy Johnson was Harlem. He ran the numbers. He protected the businesses. When Italian mobsters tried to muscle in, Bumpy sent them back bleeding. When cops harassed black-owned stores, Bumpy made phone calls that made the harassment stop. Bumpy fronted Frank the $1,000. Frank won. And just like that, Frank Lucas had a mentor. For the next 15 years, Frank learned how to think 3 moves ahead, how to build loyalty, how to make power look effortless. But most importantly, Bumpy taught him the code. "We're criminals, Frank," Bumpy told him one night in 1965. "We steal, we hustle, we do what we have to do, but there's a line. You don't poison your own people. The Italians, they don't care who dies as long as money flows. But us, we protect Harlem, because if we destroy our own neighborhood, what are we even fighting for?" Frank nodded, said he understood. He lied. Because by 1967, Frank Lucas wasn't thinking about codes or community. He was thinking about money. Real money. The kind of money that bought chinchilla coats and ringside seats and respect that had nothing to do with loyalty. Bumpy's health was failing, heart problems, everyone knew he didn't have long. And Frank saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. The Italian mob controlled the heroin trade through traditional channels, Sicily to Marseille to New York, expensive, cut to hell. By the time it hit Harlem streets, it was 5% pure at best. Frank had a better idea. Go straight to the source. Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle. Buy pure, cut it himself, control everything. He pitched it to Bumpy once. "We could make millions, Real millions. Bumpy just looked at him. No. That was the end of the conversation. Except it wasn't, because Frank wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was counting down the days. July 7th, 1968. 2:01 a.m. Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Bumpy Johnson was eating chicken and grits when his heart finally gave out. He clutched his chest, keeled over, and died in front of a dozen witnesses. 62 years old, the king of Harlem, gone. Frank Lucas was 37, and the throne was empty. Within weeks, Frank was on a plane to Bangkok, Thailand. He met with Leslie Ike Atkinson, a former Army sergeant married to Frank's cousin. Ike introduced him to suppliers in the Golden Triangle, poppy fields that stretched for miles, heroin so pure it was nearly white. Frank bought 100 kilograms, shipped it back through military connections, some say in furniture, some say in coffins. It arrived 98% pure. He cut it down to 10% for street sale, still twice as pure as anything the Italians were selling, and he branded it Blue Magic. Stamped the glassine envelopes with blue dye so customers knew what they were getting. The junkies loved it. Stronger high, better product. And Frank made sure his dealers flooded every corner Bumpy used to protect. 116th Street, 125th, Lenox Avenue. All the places Bumpy had fought to keep clean. Now they were Frank's gold mines. He wasn't just breaking Bumpy's rule. He was dancing on his grave. By 1970, Frank Lucas was making $1 million a day. He bought properties in Miami, Detroit, Chicago, a ranch with 300 Black Angus cattle. He walked into rooms and Italian mobsters stood up. Not out of respect, out of fear, because Frank Lucas had done what they couldn't. He'd cut them out completely. But here's the thing about building an empire on betrayal. Someone's always watching. What Frank didn't know, what nobody knew until much later, was that Bumpy Johnson had eyes everywhere. Even while he was dying, Bumpy kept his network alive. Bartenders, shoeshine boys, cab drivers, people nobody noticed, people who heard everything. In early 1967, rumors started reaching Bumpy. Frank's making moves. Frank's talking to people in Bangkok. Frank's asking questions about heroin distribution. Bumpy didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, he did what he always did. He watched, he listened, he built his case. He had someone photograph Frank's dealers making drops, the blue stamped envelopes, the junkies lined up on corners that used to be clean. Kids, some of them, teenagers, the same kids whose parents Bumpy had helped pay rent for. Every photo was dated, every location marked. Bumpy built a file like a prosecutor building a murder case, because to Bumpy Johnson, this was murder, slow murder. The kind that destroyed families, turned mothers into addicts, sent fathers to prison, orphaned children. Frank thought he was being careful, thought he was moving in silence. But in Harlem, silence is a myth. Somebody always talks, somebody always knows. By November 1967, Bumpy had everything he needed. 47 photographs. Documentation of Frank's operation. Proof that his protege, the kid he'd saved and taught and trusted, had become everything Bumpy despised. The smart move would have been to kill Frank. One bullet. Problem solved. But Bumpy Johnson didn't want Frank dead. He wanted Frank to live with it, to understand what he'd done, to carry that weight. So Bumpy made a phone call. Tell Frank I want to see him at Small's Paradise. Friday night, 11:30. Just him. Frank got the message. Didn't think twice about it. Bumpy was sick. Probably wanted to talk business. Maybe even apologize for being too rigid about the heroin thing. Frank actually smiled when he got the call. He had no idea he was walking into his own trial. November 14th, 1967. Frank Lucas entered Small's Paradise wearing confidence like armor. The music was loud, the crowd was thick, and in the back corner, Bumpy Johnson sat waiting with an envelope that would haunt Frank Lucas for the rest of his life. The booth was quiet, despite the jazz blasting from the stage. Bumpy sat with his back to the wall. Old habit. Never sit with your back to the door. Frank slid into the seat across from him. Bumpy looked older, thinner. The sickness was eating him from the inside, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy didn't answer immediately, just studied Frank's face, the expensive suit, the gold cufflinks, the watch that cost more than most Harlem families made in a year. Then Bumpy reached into his jacket. Frank's hand twitched toward his waistband, pure instinct, but Bumpy just pulled out the manila envelope and placed it on the table between them. "Open it." Frank's hands didn't shake. Not yet. He lifted the flap, pulled out the stack of photos, and his entire world tilted. Photo 1. Frank's dealers on 116th Street, blue envelopes visible. Photo 2. A teenage junkie, needle in arm, blue magic package on the ground beside him. Photo 3. Frank himself, exiting a building known for drug distribution. 47 photos, total. A complete map of his empire. Frank looked up. Bumpy was watching him with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was disappointment. "You know what these are," Bumpy said quietly. It wasn't a question. Frank's brain raced. Denial, explanation, defiance. He chose silence. Bumpy leaned forward. "I taught you everything. How to think, how to move, how to survive in a world that wants us dead. And the one thing I asked was that you never poison our people." "It's just business," Frank finally said. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Bumpy's jaw tightened. "Business? That's what you call this?" He tapped one of the photos. A young mother, emaciated, begging on a corner Frank's dealers controlled. "She's Harlem. Her kids are Harlem." That man, another photo, worked construction until your product put a needle in his arm. Now he robs his own family for fix money. The Italians aren't my son," Bumpy's voice cracked. Not with anger, with heartbreak. "I don't care what the Italians do. I care what you do, because I made you." The music seemed to fade. The crowd disappeared. It was just two men and the truth between them. Bumpy took a slow breath, composing himself. When he spoke again, his voice was steel. "You think you won, Frank. You think because you're making millions, because the Italians fear you, because you got the cars and the clothes and the power. You think that means you beat the game." Frank said nothing. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," Bumpy continued. "You're going to keep making money. More than you can spend. You're going to keep building this empire, and every single day, you're going to have to look at what you've done to these streets. You're going to see the mothers burying their sons, the wives leaving their husbands, the children growing up without fathers because those fathers are either dead or in prison or so strung out they don't remember their own names. I did what I had to do to survive," Frank said, and he almost believed it. Bumpy laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Survive? Frank, you're drowning. You just don't know it yet. Every dollar you make is cursed. Every brick in your empire is soaked in the blood of your own people. And one day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but one day all of it is going to collapse. And when it does, you're going to be alone. No friends, no loyalty, no code. Just you and the choices you made." Frank's hands finally started shaking, not from fear, from the weight of being seen completely. "You broke the rule, Frank, the only one that mattered. And you didn't just break it. You built your whole life on top of breaking it. You poisoned Harlem, the place that raised you, protected you, the place I was trying to build into something better." Bumpy stood slowly, as if every movement hurt. He looked down at Frank one last time. "You wanted my blessing? You wanted me to say, it's okay? That business is business? That money justifies everything?" Bumpy's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "I won't give you that. What I'll give you is this. You're going to succeed beyond your wildest dreams. You're going to be rich and feared and powerful. And it's going to destroy you anyway, because you can't build a kingdom on ashes and expect it to stand forever. He picked up his hat. One more thing, Frank. When they come for you, and they will come, you're going to give up everything, every name, every connection, every person who trusted you, because that's who you are. A man without code is a man without spine, and when the pressure comes, you'll fold like you always do. You're wrong, Frank said, but his voice was barely audible. Bumpy adjusted his hat and looked at Frank one last time, not with anger, not even with disappointment anymore, with pity. I hope I am, son. I really do. Then Bumpy Johnson walked out of Small's paradise into a cold November night. 8 months later, he'd be dead, and Frank Lucas would prove every single word Bumpy said was prophecy. Frank Lucas told himself Bumpy was just old, bitter, out of touch with how the game had changed. He told himself that right up until March 8th, 1971, the Ali Frazier fight, Madison Square Garden. Frank wore a $100,000 chinchilla coat with a matching hat. His seats were better than Frank Sinatra's, better than the Italian mob bosses. He wanted everyone to see him, to know Frank Lucas had arrived. The DEA noticed. So did the NYPD. So did every cop who'd been trying to figure out who was flooding Harlem with blue magic. 4 years later, January 28, 1975, 20 agents kicked in the door of Frank's New Jersey mansion. They found $584,683 in cash, property deeds to houses across the country, keys to Cayman Island safe deposit boxes, everything. Frank was arrested, tried, and convicted, federal and state charges, 70 years total. That's when Bumpy's second prophecy came true. Frank didn't last 6 months before he started talking. He gave up everybody, his suppliers in Thailand, his dealers in Harlem, his cousins, his brothers, his own wife's family. Over 100 convictions came from Frank Lucas's testimony. The man who'd built an empire on loyalty became the greatest snitch the criminal underworld had ever seen, just like Bumpy said he would. The sentence got reduced to 5 years. 5 years for destroying thousands of lives. Frank walked out in 1981 under witness protection, relocated, started over, got arrested again in 1984. More heroin. 7 more years. By the time Frank Lucas finally got out for good in 1991, he was 60 years old, broken, alone, and he couldn't go home. Harlem didn't want him. The streets he'd poisoned didn't forgive. The neighborhood that raised him closed its doors because everybody remembered what Bumpy had said about Frank Lucas. And everybody saw that Bumpy had been right. In 2013, Frank Lucas gave an interview to the Newark Star-Ledger. He was 82 years old, sick, tired, and for maybe the first time in his life, honest. I probably did more damage than I did good, Frank said. All I knew was I was making big dollars. It was a horrible business. I was in the heroin business, the worst you can get. If you want to put that, I was a no-good son of a bitch. Be my guest. Because that's what I was. 15 years in prison. 15 years to think about that envelope. That booth. Bumpy's words. Every single day. Richie Roberts, the prosecutor who helped put Frank away, said it plainest. Frank Lucas probably destroyed more black lives than the KKK could ever dream of. Frank Lucas died May 30th, 2019, 88 years old, outlived Bumpy by 51 years. But he never went back to Harlem, never walked those streets again. Because some doors, once you cross certain lines, stay closed forever. Bumpy Johnson died broke, no empire, no millions. Just a neighborhood that mourned him like family and remembered him as the man who protected his people even when it cost him everything. Frank Lucas died rich, famous, and utterly alone. The lesson isn't complicated. Power without conscience feels big until the lights go out and you're alone with the version of yourself you swore you'd never become. Bumpy tried to teach Frank that code was the only thing separating men from monsters. Frank learned it. He just learned it 15 years too late. In Harlem, they don't tell Frank Lucas stories to children, but they still tell Bumpy Johnson stories. Because respect isn't about how much money you make. It's about who remembers you when you're gone and why. Look, if this story hit you different, do me a favor, smash that like button. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We're dropping these hidden Black history stories every week, the ones they don't teach in school, the ones that show you how the game really worked. Drop a comment. If you were Frank, could you have walked away from that money? Could you have chosen loyalty over millions? Be honest. And turn on those notifications. Because next time, we're telling the untold story of how Bumpy Johnson walked into Lucky Luciano's office unarmed and walked out with the deal that changed organized crime forever. You don't want to miss that. Remember, in Harlem, respect wasn't given, it was earned. And once you lost it, no amount of money could buy it back.